and welcome to another edition of the Front Page on GNet TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and it's my pleasure to have as our guest today in our studios here at GNet someone who probably really doesn't need an introduction. Every now and then we get someone of that caliber, and today it's our great pleasure to have with us today in the studio former Governor Jim Douglas. Mr. Douglas, welcome, and thank you for coming back to GNet.
Well, great to be here. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, as I said, I think the former governor probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give you one anyway, just for those of you who haven't been around here a while. Many of you will know that Governor Douglas served as the governor of the state's chief executive officer from 2003 to 2011. Before that, he was the state's treasury secretary from 1995 to 2003. Before that, he was the secretary of state from 1981 to 1993. And before that, he was the House Republican Majority Leader, the youngest one of the youngest ever. We'll have to figure out if he was the youngest ever at 25, named to that post. He entered politics right out of Middlebury College in 1972 at the age of 21, representing his home constituency of Middlebury, and went on to serve the state for about 40 years in one capacity or another, and now has written a book about those years, The Vermont Way. And the governor will be appearing at the Northshire Bookstore on Sunday, December 14th. I believe it's 7 o'clock.
I think it's in the afternoon, actually.
In the afternoon? Okay. Well, you can go to the Northshire's website and find out the exact time for what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion, question and answer session, and you can hear all about it. We're fortunate today to have the governor with us to talk a little bit about what's in his book and some of his experiences along the way, and maybe even a few conjectures about current politics in Vermont. You never know. But anyway, Governor, just to kind of get us started, do you recall what it was that got you interested in politics in the first place? Now, one of the sections in your book, you talk about stuffing envelopes for the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater in 1964. Was that the kind of the starting point of it all?
I guess it was. Apparently I didn't stuff enough envelopes for Senator Goldwater, but it's interesting. A lot of people who are in politics, who get involved in the process, have some familial connections, but that wasn't the case with me. There's nobody in my family, as far as I know, who ever ran for office or was involved in politics in a significant way. So I just became interested, I guess, as a young person, and decided to go down to county headquarters, as you suggest, and volunteer. And it was interesting as a 13-year-old to see candidates for the state legislature come in, and I was in awe of these celebrities, little knowing that only 8 years later I'd be one of them myself.
So from there, you went on to Middlebury, and then right after graduation, basically, you entered the race for the state house, the state representative seat from Middlebury. Tell me what it was like, though, at Middlebury at that time. That would have been like sort of the height of the anti-war movement, shortly after the Kent State situation. That it must have been a fairly lonely crowd of Republicans on the Middlebury campus back in those years.
It really was. The Kent State incident occurred at the end of my sophomore year, I guess, and I was involved in the campus radio station as well as the Young Republicans, so I had a responsibility to cover the events as well as to participate in political activities. But I went to the student activities fair, as most entering freshmen do, and all the tables are set up around the terrace on campus, and signed up for the Young Republican Club. And you're right, Andrew, that there weren't a whole lot of us there. Not too many today either, but I got involved. I became state Young Republican chairman, and in that capacity got to meet a lot of the leaders of the Republican Party and, by extension, state government in Vermont at the time. Dick Snelling was the Republican committeeman from Chittenden County, and there were a lot of other important folks. Connie Bailey, who'd been a lieutenant governor, the first woman in the country to hold that position. She was a member of the committee, and Peanut Kennedy came in as a committee member as well. So I got to meet a lot of these folks, and I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up after graduation. I'm not sure I figured it out yet, but I decided to run for the House. There was an opening in the representation from Middlebury. It's a two-member district. One of the incumbents was stepping down, and I gained his support in a contested primary, which was key, I think, and then went on to be elected.
So that must have been an incredibly exciting experience to be at that age, to be involved in making, all the important decisions that affected the state. Was there any debate or discussion or issue that came up around that time in those early years that you remember as being either really instructive or educational or inspirational in some way or another?
Well, I think one observation I'd make is that we had the greatest percentage of a legislative chamber aged 25 and under in the country in 1973. There were, I don't know, a dozen or 15 of us, I think. I was 21, but there were 3 members younger than I. And I think what we learned quickly was that we didn't have a whole lot in common other than our age. There were Republicans and Democrats, urban and rural, different ideological stripes. So we started initially the Kids Caucus, figuring that if we got behind some issue, we could rally the troops and make a difference. But it didn't meet too many times because we realized that only our youth identified us. So I guess one key lesson was, although we had a lot of young people, it didn't matter in terms of homogeneity of the group. I have a lot of memories of my first few years there, not all of them monumental. I was assigned to the dress code committee my first year. I've never put that on my resume, but there was a lot of discussion about decorum and attire, and we had to decide monumental decisions like, should gentlemen be allowed to wear turtlenecks? We said no. Should women be allowed to wear pantsuits? And we said yes. I remember my first speech on the floor of the House that first year, a couple of months in, when I rose to offer an amendment to the budget to get money restored for the Morgan Horse Farm, which was in my legislative district, because the House Appropriations Committee had removed it entirely. And I thought, well, that can't stand. And so I put together a coalition of local legislators, farmers, UVM supporters, and we prevailed on the House floor over the committee's recommendation. So I guess succeeding on my first substantive floor fight gave me some confidence that perhaps I didn't have on my first few days.
Oh. Well, reading your book, I got the impression that you really enjoyed being the Secretary of State. That section struck me that there were things that that post had to do and involved that really you found very enjoyable. And I guess most of us probably have a vague idea of what the Secretary of State does. I mean, oversees elections, I guess. But clearly there's much more to that job than maybe meets the eye. And I wondered if you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that happened while you were Secretary of State, or some of the things that you did while you were there for 12 years that were significant or important in your view.
Well, your characterization is correct. There was a 19th century Secretary of State who called the office the scrap basket of governmental odds and ends, because the legislature, when it didn't know where to assign a particular task, gave it to the Secretary of State. So it is a vast array of responsibilities. Elections administration is the one with which it's most identified, but actually the largest part of the job in terms of staff and budget is professional regulation, licensing of different professions and disciplining those who are licensed and who go astray. It's responsible for corporate and business registration. It oversees the state archives, and now, after a change a couple years ago, all of the record-keeping functions of state government. It handles lobbyist registration and disclosure. It handles administrative rule publication and compilation, so a lot of different things. I did enjoy it because of the variety of the responsibilities, and also because I'm a student of history. I still am today. I used to love to lose myself in the archives and look at the documents, some of them originally signed by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Don't mean to drop names, Andrew. Once during the 80s, we went to an auction in New York City, and this brings to mind a recent news story, and purchased a letter that was signed by George Washington at auction because it talked about the character of Vermonters, and it was written in his own hand. In those days, we obviously didn't have word processors, but many famous people had scribes who wrote the text of letters, and then they just affixed their signature at the end. But this letter about the hardiness of Vermonters is written entirely in Washington's own hand. So I was really pleased to be able to acquire that for the state and not let it go into some private collection.
Absolutely. Well, looking back then at that time, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and comparing it to today, what strikes you as being the main change that has taken place in Vermont politics since that era? I mean, is it more contentious now? Is it less kind of congenial, or is it really pretty much the same kind of thing that someone from the 70s would remember?
I think it has changed. I remember going as a freshman in the early 70s, and I literally didn't know which party each of my colleagues belonged to. There were very few votes on the floor of the House that seemed to break down along party lines. There didn't seem to be many in committee either when I served on various committees of the House. Although there was a Republican majority at the time during my first couple of terms, it wasn't as overwhelming as we've seen a Democratic majority more recently. And I think the process works better when there's balance. It doesn't matter which party has a majority, but as long as it's fairly close, where every vote's outcome isn't preordained, when you can't take each member's vote for granted on a particular issue, I think democracy is better served. And I do see more polarization now, where unfortunately not unlike the rest of the country, although it's not as serious as it is at the national level. But the rhetoric, the talk radio and TV, the editorials, letters to the editor, I think have a sharper edge than they did in those days, and there's clearly a lot more partisanship in the General Assembly. So I think that's unfortunate. And another change, Andrew, as I see your iPad here, is technology. It's very different from those days. In fact, I was on the committee my first year that was responsible for reapportionment of the House, and I was the only member of the committee who had a calculator. And it was much larger than the ones we have. I hesitate to call it a pocket calculator because it would take a big pocket. I remember going to the store in downtown Middlebury and buying it for $80, this little thing that they give away now, right? But I was the only one who had it. And so I did all the calculations for the Government Operations Committee on how big each district was, and as we worked out a map. Well, today, of course, you just enter the towns into a program, push a button, and it prints out the number of or the population numbers for each district. There was a lot more paper at that time, which was wasted. We used to express concern about that. Do we really want to make 150 copies of this thick amendment? Well, we had no choice because each member was entitled to see the entirety of what he or she was voting on, and now, of course, it can be handled electronically. So I think that's been a positive development. But I'll give you an interesting insight on why it isn't 100% positive. I bring my students from Middlebury College to the State House each year, and we sit in on a legislative session. And in the gallery, the students say, "Well, I can see the laptops and iPads of the members, and I don't think they're looking at the business of the amendment that's before them or the bill that's being considered. I think they're checking email or playing
Facebook or something.
Yeah, or checking their portfolios or something." So they need to be careful.
Watch out. Well, as you look back over the 8 years you served as governor, I imagine there are a lot of votes that were contentious, that were close calls, that were difficult issues. I'm guessing there must be a handful that stand out as either being either difficult ones or ones that just simply were hard-fought battles. And are there any that come to mind in that short list?
There are plenty. I guess in this time of fiscal stress, the override of my veto on the 2009 budget or the 2010 budget in the 2009 session stands out because analyses have suggested that if my veto had been upheld, we wouldn't have the $100 million problem that the state's facing in its general fund today. I felt at the time, I still believe, that the level of spending the legislature authorized was excessive and sought to stop it, but I was unsuccessful. And part of that was particularly egregious. The legislature increased the estate tax retroactively, and that was outrageous in my view. Fortunately, the next year they partially rescinded that, but I said to folks, look, it's one thing to increase an income tax or a sales tax or whatever, even retroactive to the first of the year, but you can't undie. People make decisions on estate planning and business transition that are interrupted by this. And I told the story of a business owner in Franklin County who dealt with the sudden death of her dad, who ran a manufacturing company there, and then was appalled 6 months later to get an extra bill from the tax department. So I thought that was one of the worst decisions the legislature made, and they retreated from it partially. Healthcare was certainly contentious, but I really feel good about what we did. I launched the Blueprint for Health in 2003. We passed a major bill in 2006 that created Catamount Health, that established a strategy of trying to keep people healthy in the first place and not requiring expensive intervention. And the year before, in 2005, I vetoed a bill that had an increase in the income tax and a new payroll tax. And there were some hard feelings, but we worked together. And Peter Welch was the president pro tem of the Senate, and he was a good partner to work with on that. And we didn't agree. He had a very liberal caucus that he was representing, but he was determined, as I was, to get something done. And I think what we came out with was quite positive, and that's why, among other reasons, Vermont was deemed the healthiest state in the country for most of that time. I proposed a Promise Scholarship program in 2005. It was criticized, even ridiculed by some in the legislature. My proposal was to keep kids here, to offer a scholarship in exchange for a commitment to stay in Vermont for a few years after graduation. Well, they weren't interested then, but it's being discussed in Montpelier today. So I often
all that bad.
Well, I remember what Ronald Reagan said: "It's amazing how much you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit."
Right. Truer words were never spoken. Well, speaking of education, I often wonder if you reflect back on Act 68, which was passed during your time in office. As you well know, education spending and property taxes are once again back to the forefront of our discussion in Vermont. That never really goes away, I guess, but it seems like we're back to seeing that kind of at the top of the heap once more. Well, in hindsight, and I realize hindsight is 20/20, do you think that Act 68 should have been tweaked one way or another rather than the way it eventually shook out?
It's interesting. Sometimes I'm asked, "Do you have any regrets? Would you have done anything differently during your tenure?" And substantially, I feel good about what I did, the decisions I made, and how I conducted myself. But Act 68 does trouble me. The deal, as our viewers will recall, was an increase of a penny in the state sales tax in exchange for lower property taxes that were and are excessive. Well, the problem is we didn't have adequate controls on education spending. So the shift, I think, was responsible because we had very high property taxes compared to other states, a relatively low sales tax. So I think the trade was reasonable, but we didn't get the cost containment that was necessary to keep those property taxes from continuing to rise. So what I experienced in my own bill was decline the first year, then it was still sort of lower the second, and then in year 3 they're just rising again as rapidly as before. So I think not insisting on some method of controlling local school spending was problematic in Act 68.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting session, I think, coming up when the legislature attempts once again to figure out a way to reduce that spending, because unless you can reduce the spending, the taxes are eventually going to continue their inexorable rise, I guess, one would assume.
Well, it's just not sustainable, and as the Secretary of Education said in a recent report, we've got 20 or 25,000 fewer kids than we did 15 or 20 years ago. The projection is that we'll continue to see a decline in the student population for the foreseeable future, not quite at the same rapid rate that we've seen, but still a decline, and yet school spending continues to rise, and that can't happen, that can't work, and I think it's going to make us less competitive as a place to live.
Well, one of the chapters in your book that I found, of course, fascinating to read was the one about the press corps in Vermont, where you take a few of my, I guess, colleagues in the broad sense to task for being kind of not quite with the program or as on point as they might have been. I guess I just wonder, do you think as a general rule, broadly speaking, the Vermont press corps is fair and objective and reasonable, or do we just have a few folks there that have personal agendas of one sort or another?
I think generally it is a fair and reasonable group of reporters. I felt well treated on balance during the time I was in public office. Always some tough questions at press conferences or other times, but that's okay. I should be prepared to explain my views and actions and to articulate them clearly to the press and public. But my issue that I take in the book is with editorial writers, and I think that's an area where it has been less than fair. I realize that they have to sell papers, and I'm all for that.
No, we have to sell views on our website.
Oh, okay. But I think we've seen the media, certainly nationally and to some extent in Vermont, contribute to the lessening of our civil public discourse, because there are a lot of edgy editorials. Letters to the editors seem to be sharper in many cases, and I think that's unfortunate, because we want to respect other points of view. We need to recognize that we are diverse, and not everybody's going to always agree, but we ought to be able to sit down with each other and talk through those issues, find some common ground, and work through them. But I think some of the editorials that were directed at me were not fair. On the other hand, Andrew, I point out in there that at some point during the 80s, I had a little cyst on my upper back, and I went to have it dealt with, and had a topical anesthetic, and the doctor who was removing it, I heard grunting above me, and I asked, well, what's the problem? And he said, take this any way you want. You have a very thick skin.
And which helps, which is probably necessary. Well, I can't help but not ask what your thoughts are on or reflections are on the election we just had for governor in this year, last November. Very close election, 2,000 to 3,000 votes separating Governor Shumlin from Scott Milne as Republican challenger. I think a much closer outcome than most people seem to expect, at least those of us who were kind of a little on the outside and kind of just following it. I guess one thought I had is, what if you were back in the State House and you were going to be one of the legislators voting on to elect the governor, in a sense, what would be, what way would you go? Would you be driven more by the outcome in your district or by the statewide result? I mean, it must be very difficult for a legislator who's, let's say, hypothetically, his district voted for Scott Milne, but the general result was that Peter Shumlin was the winner. Is there a philosophic justification for someone to say, well, you know, my constituents said this, so I'm going to reflect what my constituents said?
Well, the Constitution gives no guidance whatsoever, so it's whatever an individual wants. I remember in 1977 when the legislature, of which I was a member, voted for the second place finisher for a lieutenant governor. The ultimate victor cited the constitutional provision that said if the freemen, the voters, don't give anyone 50%, then there, quote, is no election, unquote. and it goes to the General Assembly. So the slate is clean. They can do whatever they want. They can vote as their constituents did, the entire state plurality. They can vote for whom they think is the best candidate. It's entirely their choice, and it's, of course, by a secret ballot. But remember, in 2002, I didn't have 50%, and the narrow Democratic majority could have decided to do something different. But Doug Racine, my adversary, very graciously urged them to confirm my election. And I think under the current constitutional provision, absent something extraordinary, the plurality vote ought to be respected. Frankly, I don't think the constitutional provision is the right one. I think it ought to be changed. In the colonial days, the legislature picked the governor traditionally because there weren't popular elections, but every state except 3 have changed it so that the plurality prevails. The other 2 states have runoff elections in December, which I would say is a little more democratic. And to be honest, Andrew, I guess I'm troubled by how our current arrangement comports to the separation of powers doctrine, because if one branch of the government gets to choose another branch, then it doesn't seem to provide the co-equal and coordinate separation that the framers presumably had in mind. So I'm in favor of changing the Constitution, and perhaps that'll be discussed this coming year. Okay, well,
You go on to talk at the end of the book about some of the presidents you met, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and I can't let you go without asking you a question. There must be a really funny backstory about the picture of you and President Obama moving the furniture around in the Oval Office there. I mean, what was going on when this picture was taken?
It was Groundhog's Day, 2009.
Okay.
I happen to remember.
Appropriately enough.
Yeah, I was the first governor to have a one-on-one meeting with the new president in the Oval Office. He'd only been there a week and a half or so. And the topic was the Recovery Act, the so-called stimulus package that most governors of both parties supported one way or another. And the press came into the Oval Office to take pictures of us as we were sitting in those 2 chairs near the fireplace. And I hadn't noticed that the couches had been moved back to allow the press to come in and have adequate room. Well, after they left, the president went over to the end of one of the couches to move it back into place. And so I instinctively went to the other end of that couch and we put it back where it belonged. Within milliseconds, his staff came and moved the other one, and he probably hasn't moved any furniture since. But what's fascinating about the photo is that it was on display at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri a year or so ago, and was deemed one of the top 10 presidential photos of all time.
Oh, my.
I was shocked, too. but the caption had nothing to do with me. It suggested that the president is just an average guy, and that's why it was such an important shot.
Well, okay. The book is called The Vermont Way. Governor Douglas will be at the Northshire Bookstore Sunday, December 14th. At some point during the day, we'll find out when. I think 3 o'clock.
I think it's 3. I think it's 3 o'clock.
Usually,
yes.
would be the time they would have an afternoon event. So, if you have the time, I'm sure it would be an interesting way to spend the afternoon. I was just wondering, Governor, you're currently teaching politics and government now at Middlebury. Do you have any future plans beyond that, or going to just stay put there for a while?
I don't know. I'm not sure that's a new calling, but I've appreciated the opportunity for a few years to interact with the next generation, and it's kind of like a time warp because I graduated 40 or so years ago, and now I'm back on campus. They've got technology that certainly my contemporaries and I didn't have, but it's a good experience, and they're very accomplished. I'm on a few company boards. I've been working with an organization in Washington called the Bipartisan Policy Center, perhaps a quixotic mission to get them to talk to each other down there, but we've had some limited success, and so I'm finding ways to stay busy.
Very good. Well, thank you once again for making the time available to come down and talk with us and share some of your thoughts about the last 40 years of Vermont politics. Fascinating reading. I think anyone who has an interest in Vermont politics will find it most enjoyable. Well, thank you all for being with us today. This has been The Front Page on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. Been a pleasure to be with you today, and we'll see you the next time.